Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you all. We are very happy to be in Sofia, and we want to be really in Sofia. So we want to broadcast from our one of our important art institutions, our city gallery, city art gallery, and with us is one our friend, Lachezar Boyadzhiev. Lachezar is famous and influential Bulgarian artist, contemporary artist. He works in the field of art installations, video art, photography, drawings, objects, and so on in many fields of contemporary art. He's the co-founder of the Institute of Contemporary Art in Sofia, and he now will make us a virtual guide tour in a special exhibition that we have in our city gallery. It is an exhibition dedicated to an artist from Bulgarian origin, Christo, and Jeanne-Claude, his wife. And this exhibition tells us the story of their artwork and their life, of course. And I don't want to lose your time. And I'm very happy to give the floor to, and to thanks, of course, to Lachezar Boyadzhiev to make our first real broadcast in Access.
Okay, let me see if okay, can you see me?
Hello, yes,
Hi.
We see you.
Hi, this is me, and I'm just gonna say a few words. Besides being an artist, I'm also kind of occasionally a curator, and I just spent the last 3-4 days in the city of Pristina in Kosovo on the business of Manifesto 14, which is the nomadic European art biennial. And I have to tell you that I love these networks of partners across the continent, across the world. Then, without further ado, I'll try to switch my camera to another. Tricky, but hold on. Okay. Right. Oh. Okay, what you see now is the interior of the Sofia Municipal Art Gallery with the exhibition of Christo and Jeanne-Claude. This is a wall-sized biography of theirs. There are photographs by Wolfgang Woltz, a German photographer, who has been recording Christo and Jeanne-Claude's projects. He's also very well known for the fact that he's preparing the initial photographs on which all these magnificent drawings by Christo are executed. Now, that was the first room. The second room we will see in a while, but I just wanted to take you briefly over a few points of the life of Christo and Jeanne-Claude, whom you may or may not know, but you have certainly been unable to avoid the media noise in the last month because of their first posthumous and probably could be the last posthumous project, the Arc de Triomphe wrapped in Paris. Now, that is the first drawing for that, the first collage by Christo in 1961. These are the two artists. They were born on the same day, June 13th, 1935, the same month, the same year, and as Jeanne-Claude claims, from two different mothers, and Christo claims on the same second. That I cannot ever be sure about, and there is no mothers alive to ask nowadays. So this is the first project that made them famous. Right after the erection of the Berlin Wall, they blocked a very, very tiny street on the left bank of the Seine River in Paris, Rue Visconti, for several hours without actually asking permission. I mean, without having a permission. They asked the permission from the city, but they never get a permission. And only the charm of Jeanne-Claude, whose father is a French general of the de Gaulle circle, prevented them from being arrested. So this is Iron Curtain of oil barrels. And this was a comment on the Berlin Wall. And then after a while, as you probably know, as we were growing up, as I was growing up, and a generation of artists of my age were growing up, Christo was a no-no. He had left Bulgaria after studying for a few years in the art school. And then he left for Prague. And then during the uprising in Budapest in 1956, 57, in January 57, he left illegally. He went to Vienna and then to Geneva and then eventually ending up in Paris. So he was always an expatriate, immigrant, a deserter from the army. He never came back to Bulgaria, even though his mother and his father were begging the authorities in the 80s to let him come back or to, for the family to see each other. That never happened. But when I first heard of him, it was this particular work at the end of the 60s, the wrapped rocks on the coast near Sydney. It looks like this. And that gave me that gave me the inspiration in December 1989, together with 11 other young artists in Bulgaria, just after Berlin Wall went down. So December 89, once we were having drinks, and maybe we were a little bit carried away, but because we decided to send a letter to Christo, an open letter to Christo and Jeanne-Claude, congratulating him on his namesake day, Christmas, Christo in Bulgarian, and in Greek it means Jesus Christ, and also asking him to please come back to Bulgaria and wrap up the whole country, if possible. And that does put an end to the age and era of totalitarian rule in Bulgaria and presumably in the rest of the Soviet bloc. That never happened, but anyhow, that was a gesture of identification. And ever since that time and much later, I mean, I got much more involved with research on the work of Christo and Jeanne-Claude, following some of their projects as much as I could when they would be in reality, and researching basically a lot about the financial structure behind their projects, the financial operation, the inner workings of the CVJ Corporation, as it is called. By the way, I would be very happy at the end of this short tour to answer any questions you might have about Christo and Jeanne-Claude's work, or about Sofia, contemporary art in Bulgaria, and so on and so forth. Now, the most amazing part, as Christo defined it in some years ago, is there are three aspects, actually, the most amazing three aspects of their work. Number one is the beauty, which is obvious, and the freedom to realize this beauty. Number two is the CVJ Corporation, the freedom which comes from financial independence. And number two and number three, it is the process of negotiating the use of public space, or as we could put it a little bit in a wider context, this is like the ecological aspect. Now, the amazing thing about the drawings of Christo is that they are based on photography, the photographs of Wolfgang Volz. They are like architectural studies. He didn't use projection, and basically that is why he died, because all his life he was using dry materials like dry pastel, charcoal, pencil, and he was always spraying these drawings with fixative, and these sprays affected his lungs. So at the end, he died to a disease connected to his lungs. And just something like this. I don't know if anybody was in Paris during the wrapping of their triumphal arch, but that's the fabric they used. And they used it because right here, somewhere here, there is the internal flame. And it's like, it's a war monument, the Arc of Triumph, but it's also very cherished, very loved, very much loved monument by French people and especially in Paris. So they're war veterans and soldiers who are keeping the eternal flame inside the ark all the time burning. And in order to, their only request, they loved the idea, they loved the project. The only request they made was that the fabric, which is especially produced for each project by Christo and Jeanne-Claude, is not anonymous beige or some kind of whitish fabric, but it refers somehow to the French national symbols. And that's why the fabric on one side was like aluminum covered, on the other side it's blue, and the ropes were red, just like the colors of the French flag. Of course, just without waiting for any questions, these fabrics are not really fabric in the sense of blue jeans or a corduroy or any sort of regular fabric you might find in the shops. They're especially produced, and the brilliant part of this business plan is that as soon as Christo makes an absolutely 100%, even more than 100% detailed plan and research, engineering, material-wise, the workforce needed, and so on and so forth, the ecological aspect and all the permissions. So as soon as this is realized, along with the same process, when they commission the production of the fabric, they also get a discount because after the installation is dismantled, the fabric is returned, usually resold back to the producer, then it is recycled, and then it is never damaging the environment. There are slight differences in some projects, which I will refer to, very interesting, like the running fans from 1976 in California. But before that, I just want to go to the drawing here. Right, this drawing is, we don't have original drawings in the exhibition. They're extremely expensive to borrow. We only have photographs of drawings. But this project, unlike any other of Christo's, it was relatively small in scale, centrally located in a top European city, top world city, in a very central location in that city. And yet, this public sculpture was probably the first time this public monument, and as it was wrapped, it became like a sculpture more than an architectural construction. It was the first ever work by Christo and Jeanne-Claude that people actually were not only encouraged, but they wanted to hug and touch and caress and lean on from at the bottom, where here on the street level, and on top where there was a terrace accessible to visitors. Okay, so now we go to the beauty part. You will see eventually, I mean, in all these photographs, beautiful photographs, and if you have seen at least one realized original work by Christo and Jeanne-Claude, and this is the actual wrapping of a building, in this case, Pont Neuf in Paris in 1985. The question of beauty is unquestionable. It's like unavoidable, but it is also answered always in the positive. You may dislike the spending of money, you may dislike the abuse of national monuments, but you cannot question the beauty because it is the beauty of the drawings, like a very, very classical, very brilliant draftsman, and the beauty of the project in reality, which plays with the water, with the cityscape, with the air, with the airflow and wind and the light, basically. However, to get to this point of realizing a project, it is a long, long process of negotiations, as you no doubt have heard, and it takes sometimes more than 20 years, sometimes 60 years in the case of the Arc of Triumph. And behind each permission, there is a curiosity, like an anecdote, something interesting. For instance, the Arc of Triumph in Paris, they got the permission to wrap it in 2017 after the floating piers on Lake Iseo, and by invitation from the Centre Pompidou in Paris. At first, there was supposed to be an exhibition, and Monsieur Blistan, at that time the director of Pompidou Center, invited Christo to think of a project to realize in Paris. And Christo said, well, the only thing that I will actually do is to rekindle a project from 1961 to wrap the Arc of Triumph, and he never ever thought that he will get a permission. But then he did get a permission, partially because the Arc of Triumph is part of the patrimony, or whatever it's called, like the Department of Natural Cultural Heritage, which is also somehow connected to the Centre Pompidou. But here you see some photographs of the process of negotiation, which in this case, this is about Pont Neuf. It took them 10 years between 1975 and 1985. And there are always very interesting and very detailed films about the realized projects. But in this case, the interesting part is that Jeanne-Claude finally, and that's her here, had to use her personal connections, her father, to convince the then mayor of the city, Jacques Chirac, to let her husband, an artist at the time, they were not signing their real projects together, but only Christo, so Christo, to wrap the pognon. And Christo only got the permission after Jacques Chirac was satisfied and happy to have won another round of another, how do you call it, another term as a mayor of the city of Paris. So although in theory, they were on the same side in terms of aesthetic preferences. In practice, the political considerations always get in the way. Even more so with the case of the Reichstag, which project is the only project that is not initially conceived by either Christo or Jeanne-Claude, but by an American architect by the name of Michael Cullen, who sent in 1971, he sent just a black and white postcard with the depiction of the Reichstag to Christo and Jeanne-Claude, and basically suggesting so they should get interested in wrapping the building. And this is obviously a process of negotiation from the 70s, I believe, where you see Willy Brandt. It took three rounds of three rejections of the project until at some point in the early 90s, the Reichstag, actually the only case when a parliament, national parliament, is voting on a permission to realize a work of art. So the Reichstag, its third or fourth meeting, gave the permission to Christo to wrap the Reichstag just before it went under reconstruction. And I will show you the photograph of the wrapped Reichstag, which is even now probably the most popular work of art ever. It was enjoyed by more than nearly 5 million visitors. And it then went under reconstruction. But the shrouding, the covering, the wrapping of a public building, wherever in the world, is it's a metaphysical question. Why did he start doing it? What does it signify? Is this a shroud, a veil? Well, the common kind of wisdom says that he started it because he didn't really have, he was very poor. He was actually making a living at the beginning in Vienna, in Geneva, in Paris. He was making a living by painting portraits of wealthy ladies, and that's how he met the mother of Jeanne-Claude. Then they got married. But at first, he was just wrapping objects, and that was referred to his nomadic background. That referred to his escaping, to never being sure which, where, and how, and he will end up the next month or day or evening, and so on. Okay, so the Reichstag. And then we go to, of course, obviously, Christo was also aware, for those of you having a little bit of knowledge about the history of Europe and the world prior to World War II, there was a famous case, as soon as the Nazis came to power at the beginning of the 30s, in 1933 or 33, I think, there was a fire in the Reichstag, and there was a famous trial in Leipzig, which was on trial were put 3 Bulgarian communists at the time, George Dimitrov being the most famous one, and 1 Dutch communist for supposedly having put the Reichstag to fire. And that particular story, whatever truth, there was no truth to it, but it was part of the political history and the situation in the world before World War II. So that was very much something that Christo knew, and that's why he immediately knew that he would get on and he would make everything possible to realize this wrapping, which is in fact, had he realized that before the fall of the Berlin Wall, it would have been the first work of art seen simultaneously between the East and West of Europe. Which of course, when they did it, it didn't happen, but it was already a unified Germany, at least politically, but not mentally. In any event, this particular spectacle gave again, confirmed the initial idea of Christo and Jeanne-Claude that every such visual intervention, every such delicate change of the visual environment leads to the reevaluation, thinking again, seeing again, particular object, which sometimes is loaded with political history. Okay, and then I'll finish up with the financial plan, but first let me show you one of the most beautiful and one of the most poetic projects by Christo and Jeanne-Claude. It's from the 70s. It's called The Running Fans. And it's over 24, I believe, maybe 26 kilometers of this kind of curtain stretched on aluminum pillar, poles and aluminum strings, and it goes over the hills and the private lands of the farmers in an area of Central California, just north of the city of San Francisco in Sonoma and Marin County, and it ends up in the ocean. Now, this particular project is interesting because here, on top of talking to ecologists, on top of talking to the state officials, they had to convince each one of the 50 or more than 50 farmers on whose land this fence had to go, provided that they were always saying that we will leave openings for all the traffic to go, all the animals to go. Where there are roads, there will be openings, so we will not disturb the movement of people and vehicles and animals. And what is, well, first of all, this particular form, I tell you, it refers to the Orient Express and to the students' years of Christo. When he was still a student in the art school, which is the same school which I graduated, but much later, that was the 50s. This was hardcore Stalinist kind of Soviet type of regime in Bulgaria, a totalitarian regime. And the art students from the art school, they went, like we did much later in the 70s, they went on summer brigades. And what Christo in particular was engaged with his colleagues from the mural department and the painting department, they were rearranging the yards of the cooperative farms along the route of this famous Orient Express that was running from from Vienna or Paris to Istanbul, and was crossing the area of Bulgaria between Sofia, Plovdiv, and then going diagonally southeast into Istanbul. So this is when he learned how to work with the landscape, how to follow a particular line, like as a drawing across the landscape. Well, then to finish with this particular project, what finally convinced the farmer to allow Christo and Jeanne-Claude to realize this project was that every farmer at the end of the project, when the materials would be dismantled and put together, so every farmer got to keep the section of the wall, like from here up to wherever, on whose all the materials that happen to be on your land, you get to keep afterwards, and you can use them on your farm. And if you have ever lived in the countryside, it's a very, very attractive proposition, because this is like useful. You can see the use of it. This is also the first project which asked for hundreds of pages of the so-called Environmental Protection Agency. So Christo and Jeanne-Claude paid for an official report. And after so many pages of discussing the potential damage or not damage on the environment by this particular intervention, the final conclusion of the agents who were evaluating, the experts who were thinking and exercising their expertise, was that the only long-term effect on the environment this particular project might have, and will certainly have, is on the mentality of the people who see it or who experience it or are part of it. Okay, so this is the running fence, and I think I might be going a little bit over time, but that is the Christo at work in the studio. They called him, he's the machine to produce drawings. And Jeanne-Claude, who was the engineering genius and the manager genius behind their work, they called her, we call her Jeanne-Claude Van Damme. I probably neglected to tell you that, forgot to tell you that I know them since 1981, when by sheer chance and luck, I happened to be in New York for a while in the very, very early 80s. Okay, so I'll now go to a little bit to the last project. And I hope that somebody has heard or seen this exceptionally beautiful work, which is called Floating Piers in Lake Iseo. In northern Italy, very near to the city of Brescia and Bergamo. This was probably the most dangerous project ever. There were 3 kilometers, excuse me, of these floating piers, literally floating on the surface of the water of Lake Iseo. And at some point in time, there were upwards of 10,000, 15,000 people walking on these constructions which are made of plastic volumes, very much looking like a gasoline tube or something like this, like containers, which are positioned with specially designed anchors to the bottom of the lake, and they're very, very solid made. And on top, of course, is stretched this yellowish fabric. But the thing is that they were so secure that it was more than, I think it was more than 1.5 million people who visited, and that brought more than 20 million euro of business to the small city of Solzano and the neighboring small villages around the lake because of the influx of people. But if something should have happened in terms of engineering and safety of the people, there was no way anybody could have been saved, because the waters of this lake here are not only very cold, but it's at this particular point in the middle, they're more than 500 meters deep, 300 to 600 at certain points. And then we go to the process of funding, of how do they make this beauty possible for people to enjoy. That's how. First is the Christo with his very, very classical talent. And then it's Jeanne-Claude with her very, very classical managerial talent and extreme inventiveness. This project from 1983 was one of the earliest and most beautiful ones, and also very problematic because you cannot actually see it unless you hire a helicopter or a boat. It was from as I said, 1983 in the Biscayne Bay near the city of Miami. There were 11 surrounded islands. They were not wrapped, they were surrounded. Ecologically, again, a study. There were birds birding there on these islands. But what happened was that after studying for a year or so, the possible potential impact on ecological terms over the life in the natural life of these islands, it turned out that first they were extremely polluted. So the crew of Christo and Jeanne-Claude, they cleaned up upwards of 40 tons of garbage from the islands before they could use them in their natural beauty. And then it turned out that birds are, on the contrary, are attracted even more to the islands, and even an animal which I'm not sure what exactly it was called, but it's kind of the nickname of it was like a kind of a water cow or something like that, which was actually breeding in this particular environment. In fact, it turned out that as a result of the wrapping, they loved the shade under the pink fabric, where they found a much more protected and much more natural environment for whatever activities, sex-wise, they were engaged with. So this is actually the only project which is, in fact, the invention of Jeanne-Claude, and it is dedicated to the mother of Christo, whose original name, the mother's name is Sveta, and in Bulgarian that means flower. Okay, so a bit of the workings of the project, on the project. But then let's go to the drawings. Because of this huge amount of money needed to realize these projects, and because of all the permissions and the long process of preparing and paying to all sorts of experts for doing what Christo and Jeanne-Claude wanted to do, and do it as free people who never ever wanted to depend on anybody else's money, although they do borrow money from banks nowadays. But in order to get there, it was a long process. So for one of their first projects like this Valley Curtain, they established a corporation at the end of the 60s, early 70s. And the corporation is like an entity. It sells drawings, it gets the permissions, it's a legal subject. It's a legal subject that authorities know whom to hold responsible. If it goes bankrupt, well, the project is not realized, and that's the end of it. And they were doing this for each one of the projects up until the surrounded islands, at which point two brilliant people, one financial expert who now has a gallery for many years in New York, Jeffrey Deitch, and then their lawyer, Scott Hollis from Chicago, together with Jeanne-Claude, they invented the so-called CVJ Corporation. CVJ comes from the initials of Christo and his original name, Christo Vladimirov Yavashev. Okay, so at first, Jeffrey Deitch, a legendary figure now in the international art world, realized that every time Christo and Jeanne-Claude are before completing a project, let's say the last 6 months, They always go to him and ask him to please find clients so that they can pay, sell drawings, so that they can cover the costs, the running costs for preparing for a project. At which point he said, look, you are already a famous artist. Why don't you collateralize your drawings? Why don't you think of them as an asset and get a loan by guaranteeing the loan from a bank with your drawings or older works? And then they got, at that time, Jeffrey Deitch was working for Citi Corporation, Citibank of New York, early 80s. And he secured for them the so-called revolving credit line, which means that they can always have cash available. And then when they say sell drawings and they don't have to cut down the price, they replenish, so to say, their credit line. They secure the new, what is it called? The revolving of the credit. They secure the dynamics of having money. In this way, they would never, ever afterwards worried about Fridays when initially they had to pay all the workers, all the experts. They always had cash. But after this first round and four surrounded islands in 1982, their lawyer, Scott Hodges, told them, I mean, why bother making a corporation, like establishing a new corporation every time? Why don't you do a holding? And this is what CVJ Corporation is, a holding. It is registered in the state of Delaware, which state does not it's almost like an offshore zone. Of all the legislatures in the United States, this one has the nearest. It is the nearest equivalent to an offshore zone. For instance, if there is a change in the property of the corporation, if there is a new shareholder, then in most states in USA, you have to have a meeting of the shareholders and new registration. Not so in Delaware. And there are many other benefits in this respect. But the interesting part about CVJ Corporation is something completely different. And it was covered in 1984 by the Wall Street Journal. In 2006, after the Gates project in Central Park in New York, the Harvard Business School made the so-called Harvard case study, which explored in detail the way the Gates were funded by a credit line from a Swiss bank, and how the credit guarantees were achieved, at what ratio, and what was the whole scheme, the whole agreement. Now, the CVJ Corporation, when it was registered in '82 in Delaware, used as its main asset as a holding corporation the talent of the artist, which is an abstraction. You cannot buy a share in the talent of the artist. But the holding is the main purpose. The holding is not producing anything. And a holding can only be a holding corporation if it has, at least according to the United States legislature, if it has more than 50%, 51% ownership in the shares in other corporations. So imagine the main purpose of this holding corporation is to create to realize the ideas of its main asset, which is the talent of the artist. So the talent becomes incorporated. And the main, the way projects are funded are by selling the drawings which the artist is producing for each particular project. In this way, every drawing by Christo within the financial terminology and the legislature, corporate legislature of the state of Delaware, each drawing has a dual function. On one level, it is just a work of art that you can collect. But on another level, it is a financial instrument. Consequently, if you buy a drawing by Christo for Surrounded Islands, you're not only buying a drawing, you're actually investing in the workings of the daughter corporation of CVJ, which is called Surrounded Islands Corporation, which is registered again with Delaware. And if you, some years ago, while Christo was still alive, I was having fun periodically going through the corporate register of the state of Delaware, and you just need to check the new trademarks. I mean, it's not so easy, but you can, if you know what to look for, you can eventually you hit on the new project that Christo is working on without it having been announced publicly, which was a nice thing to do. Okay, and then how to finish with this financial kind of thing is that as their operations grew, as the projects became more and more expensive, they were always running late on repaying the loans from the banks. And then how it happens is that when they take a loan from a bank, provided that Christo is already a very well-known artist, and his works are collateralized, so they guarantee the loans with their old works, and they repay the loans with the drawings for each particular project, which whose status I just explained. And I will finish this tour. I hope it's not very, very long, with the project Gates for Central Park in New York. This is probably the most compromising and probably one of the most beloved projects by the people who live in a certain city where the project was realized. It was initially conceived in 1979, and it was supposed to take place during the winter. The gates were supposed to, excuse me, during the summer when the trees are green, and the gates were supposed to be made out of yellowish fabric, not this kind of saffron color, which later on became the color of Jeanne-Claude's hair when in the last years of her life. But in fact, between 1979 and almost for 30 years, in 2001, what is it? No, it's not. It's less than 30, but let's say more than 20 years. They couldn't get a permission. The park was always used by so many people in the summer that nobody wanted to allow them to install for 2 weeks, to keep the gates for 2 weeks, and then to dismantle for 2 weeks, which is a normal procedure in most of the projects realized by Christo and Jeanne-Claude. So half of the summer is gone, people cannot use the park. But what happened was that there was 9/11. On September 11th, 2001, there was the attack on the World Trade Center. At that time, the mayor of the city was Rudy Giuliani, and we all know what kind of shock is created all over the world, and let alone in New York, and how many people died, and what is the political context, and so on and so forth. Then there were elections in the city of New York, and Mike Bloomberg, a multimillionaire, a collector, and a friend of Christo's and Jeanne-Claude, became the mayor of the city of New York. And so he said, well, look, I will give you a permission to do this project as a way to rejuvenate, to give new hope to the city, to make it like, again, a spectacle and a happy spectacle, a happy occasion to change the image of the city. Under several conditions. First, you don't do it in the summer. You do it in the winter, when the city is, when the park is used less. You do it, you don't ask for any money whatsoever by the city. On the contrary, if you are producing souvenirs, and that was the first time when they produced T-shirts, all sorts of souvenirs, and those were sold, and the proceeds went to the so-called Central Park Conservancy, which is the non-profit organization taking care of the park and being responsible for the park. And indeed, when this finally happened in February, this project happened in February 2005. It was in the winter. The gates had different structures. They didn't damage the pathways in any ways. See these concrete pedestals on which they were mounted. I happened to be there just because of a conference related to Christo and Jeanne-Claude, but it was millions of people enjoying, and that was such a great sight to see. At the same time, where was I? The proceeds that this particular project generated, the money that it generated from people going there, buying stuff, all of it went back to to supporting the Central Park as a place in New York and running it properly. What else? I mean, I've taken a lot of your time, but I will just stop now, and if you have any questions, please say so. You hear me?
Yes, we hear you. We are so impressed that I think that everyone